When he was done, he got the deputy's wallet out of his pocket and took the money and put it in the pocket of his shirt and dropped the wallet to the floor. Then he picked up his air tank and the stun gun and walked out the door and got into the deputy's car and started the engine and backed around and pulled out and headed up the road. On the interstate, he picked out a late-model Ford sedan with a single driver and turned on the lights and hit the siren briefly. The car pulled onto the shoulder. Chigurh pulled in behind him and shut off the engine and slung the tank across his shoulder and stepped out. The man was watching him in the rearview mirror as he walked up. "What's the problem, officer?" he said. "Sir, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" The man opened the door and stepped out. "What's this about?" he said. "Would you step away from the vehicle, please?" The man stepped away from the vehicle. Chigurh could see the doubt come into his eyes at this blood-stained figure before him, but it came too late. He placed his hand on the man's head like a faith healer. The pneumatic hiss and click of the plunger sounded like a door closing. The man slid soundlessly to the ground, a round hole in his forehead, from which the blood bubbled and ran down into his eyes, carrying with it his slowly uncoupling world visible to see. Chigurh wiped his hand with his handkerchief. "I just didn't want you to get blood on the car," he said. Moss sat with the heels of his boots dug into the volcanic gravel of the ridge and glassed the desert below him with a pair of 12-power German binoculars. His hat pushed back on his head, elbows propped on his knees. The rifle strapped over his shoulder with a harness leather sling was a heavy-barreled .270 on a .98 Mauser action with a laminated stock of maple and walnut. It carried a uninertal telescopic sight of the same power as the binoculars. The antelope were a little under a mile away. The sun was up less than an hour, and the shadow of the ridge and the Datilla and the rocks fell far out across the floodplain below him. Somewhere out there was the shadow of Moss himself. He lowered the binoculars and sat studying the land. Far to the south, the raw mountains of Mexico, the breaks of the river. To the west, the baked terracotta terrain of the running borderlands. He spat dryly and wiped his mouth on the shoulder of his cotton work shirt. The rifle would shoot half-minute of angle groups, 5-inch groups at 1,000 yards. The spot he'd picked to shoot from lay just below a long talus of lava scree, and it would put him well within that distance. Except that it would take the better part of an hour to get there, and the antelope were grazing away from him. The best he could say about any of it was that there was no wind. When he got to the foot of the talus, he raised himself slowly and looked for the antelope. They'd not moved far from where he last saw them, but the shot was still a good 700 yards. He studied the animals through the binoculars, in the compressed air motes and heat distortion, a low haze of shimmering dust and pollen. There was no other cover, and there wasn't going to be any other shot. He wallowed down in the scree and pulled off one boot and laid it over the rocks and lowered the forearm of the rifle down into the leather and pushed off the safety with his thumb and sighted through the scope. They stood with their heads up, all of them, looking at him. "Damn," he whispered. The sun was behind him, so they couldn't very well have seen light reflect off the glass of the scope. They had just flat seen him. The rifle had a Kanjar trigger, set to 9 ounces, and he pulled the rifle and the boot toward him, with great care, and sighted again, and jacked the crosshairs slightly, up the back of the animal, standing most broadly to him. He knew the exact drop of the bullet in 100-yard increments. It was the distance that was uncertain. He laid his finger in the curve of the trigger. The boar's tooth he wore on a gold chain spooled onto the rocks inside his elbow. Even with the heavy barrel and the muzzle brake, the rifle bucked up off the rest. When he pulled the animals back into the scope, he could see them all standing as before. It took the 150-grain bullet the better part of a second to get there, but it took the sound twice that. They were standing, looking at the plume of dust where the bullet had hit. Then they bolted, running almost immediately at top speed out upon the barriel, with the long wang of the rifle shot rolling after them and caroming off the rocks and yawing back across the open country in the early morning solitude. He stood and watched them go. He raised the glasses. One of the animals had dropped back and was packing one leg, and he thought that the round had probably skipped off the pan and caught him in the left hindquarters. He leaned and spat. "Damn," he said. He watched them out of sight beyond the rocky headlands to the south.